The air war over North Vietnam became the largest and most dramatic aerial conflict since 1945. Dozens of aircraft types from both sides participated in it. However, just as in the Korean War, 1951 to 1953, the main burden of the air combat fell on the wings of two primary types of combat aircraft. The outcome of the clashes between them largely determined the course of the struggle. On the American side, the primary aircraft was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II fighter. Created in 1958, this heavy, two-seat, twin-engine machine, with a normal takeoff weight of over 20 tons, was originally intended to provide air defense for U.S. carrier groups. By the early 1960s, the Phantom II, having set a number of world speed records, was arguably the most popular American combat aircraft. The undisputed merits of the F-4 included flight characteristics that were outstanding for their time. Maximum speed 2,260 kilometers per hour, service ceiling 16,600 to 17,900 meters, and a practical range without drop tanks of 2,380 kilometers. A powerful onboard fire control radar and a unique weapons suite. This suite included AIM-9 Sidewinder short-range air-to-air missiles, standard load 4 units, and AIM-7 all-aspect, all-weather medium-range guided missiles. 4 missiles were mounted on semi-recessed hardpoints under the fuselage. U.S. naval aviation entered the war with F-4B carrier-based fighters. Later, improved F-4J carrier-based aircraft joined the fray. The U.S. Air Force had F-4C fighters at the start of the war. During the war, these were supplemented by improved F-4D aircraft, and in the final stage of combat, the Air Force received the most advanced version of the Phantom, the F-4E. The Phantom's main rival, the MiG-21 frontline fighter, was also created in 1958. Unlike the American aircraft, the Russian machine, intended for operations over the front line at a short distance from its home base, belonged to a different weight class. The normal takeoff weight of the variants used in Vietnam was less than 8 tons and had a significantly shorter range, about 1,500 kilometers. However, in terms of other flight characteristics, maximum speed 2,175 to 2,300 kilometers per hour, service ceiling 18,000 to 19,000 meters, and a practical range without drop tanks of about 2,400 kilometers, the MiG-21 was not inferior to its American rival. The MiG-21's armament was also significantly weaker than that of the American. 2, later 4, R-3S medium-range air-to-air missiles with infrared homing, a Soviet pirate copy of the American AIM-9 Sidewinder guided missile, as well as one 23mm or 30mm cannon, absent on some variants. As we can see, the MiG-21 and the F-4 are very different aircraft, created to fulfill different missions. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a combat engagement between the American destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy and Vietnamese torpedo boats on August 2, 1964, the United States decided to launch an air war against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, which was aiding the insurgents in South Vietnam, whose government was in turn supported by the USA. On August 5, 1964, the first American bomb struck the torpedo boat base at Vinh. Fighter cover for the strike aircraft was provided by F-4B fighters from the aircraft carrier USS Constellation, CVA-64. These were the first combat sorties for the Phantoms. However, throughout 1964, only a few limited strikes were launched against North Vietnam. Before commencing a full-scale air war, the U.S. needed to regroup and build up its forces in the region. By early February of the following year, 3 attack aircraft carriers with 238 aircraft and 33 escort ships had already been concentrated off the coast of the DRV. On February 8th, the transfer of the first U.S. Marine Corps Air Wing, which included 15 F-4B fighters, began from Okinawa to the South Vietnamese Air Base at Da Nang. At the same time, the deployment of U.S. Air Force squadrons equipped with F-100, F-105, and F-4C aircraft began at South Vietnamese and Taiwanese air bases. On March 2, the U.S. commenced the large-scale air operation Rolling Thunder, which lasted until October 31, 1968. During the initial stage of hostilities, Air Force Phantoms were used both for escorting fighters and for striking ground targets. Naval F-4Bs were used primarily to escort carrier-based attack aircraft, Sky Raiders and Skyhawks, and to protect carrier groups from possible counterattacks by Vietnamese and Chinese aircraft. In the initial period of the war, the North Vietnamese Air Force and Air Defense Forces possessed only 25 subsonic J-5 fighters, Chinese-made MiG-17Fs, several Soviet MiG-15 bis, and Il-28 bombers. These insignificant forces could not offer serious resistance to the Americans, who flew in the skies over Vietnam as if they were at home. However, with the help of Soviet and Chinese military specialists, the Vietnamese soon developed tactics for using their fighters that allowed them to inflict significant blows on the enemy, even in the face of overwhelming numerical superiority. Small groups of MiGs loitered at low altitudes outside the detection range of enemy radar. The Americans used airborne early warning aircraft, precursors to modern AWACS, as well as air control centers located on ships cruising off the coast of North Vietnam, equipped with powerful radar stations. Upon the appearance of enemy aircraft, the MiGs would launch surprise attacks on their formations, using their cannons to shoot down strike aircraft heavily laden with bombs. The first real combat engagement involving the F-4 took place on April 9. According to the American version, it unfolded as follows. At 8:40 a.m., a U.S. Navy F-4B fighter launched from the aircraft carrier USS Ranger was attacked over the sea by 4 Vietnamese MiG-17 aircraft. One of them was shot down by a Sparrow missile. However, another MiG soon maneuvered onto the Phantom's tail and struck it with a cannon burst. The crew of the American aircraft, pilot T. Murphy and radar intercept officer R. Fegan, were killed. There is also another Chinese version of this battle. According to this account, an American air patrol consisting of 8 F-4Bs intruded into airspace over territorial waters, not of Vietnam as stated in the American report, but of the PRC in the area of Hainan Island in the Gulf of Tonkin. It is possible that the Americans intentionally provoked the Chinese side into decisive action, hoping to teach them a lesson and make them more cautious in their military support of the DRV. But the lesson did not prove instructive. Early in the battle, Lieutenant Murphy's crew did indeed manage to damage one of the MiGs with a missile, which, however, was not shot down, but returned safely to base and was later returned to service. Another Phantom, firing a Sidewinder missile at yet another Chinese fighter, mistakenly hit the F-4B piloted by Murphy, sending it to the bottom of the Gulf of Tonkin. On May 12th, 12 F-4Bs intruded into the airspace of Yunnan Province, southwest China, and shot down one J-5, which was, according to the Chinese version, conducting a training flight. In response to the PRC's protest, the Americans announced that the MiG had been destroyed over DRV territory within the combat zone, though no one attempted to verify this fact. On June 4th, a flight of MiG-17Fs attacked a trio of F-4Bs over the city of Vu Ban. One Phantom evaded the engagement and, trailing smoke from engines running at maximum power, headed east. The other 2 American aircraft were drawn into a close-range turning fight, where the more maneuverable MiGs held the advantage and the Vietnamese did not hesitate to exploit it. After a 180-degree turn, the leader of the Vietnamese flight opened fire on one of the American machines from a distance of 1,000 to 1,200 meters. Soon, he closed the distance to 700 meters and opened fire again. The F-4B, striving to escape the fire, maneuvered aggressively in altitude and heading. The second American fighter, following his leader, made a desperate attempt to rescue his commander, trying to get the MiG from behind at a range of 400 to 500 meters, a completely impossible task, as the minimum permitted launch range for the AIM-9B Sidewinder is significantly greater. The wingman MiG-17 opened defensive cannon fire, and the second American fighter was forced to break away, performing a diving turn. He was immediately followed by the first F-4B, which had sustained several hits. According to Vietnamese command records, this Phantom failed to reach its airfield and crashed in Laos. On June 17th, the Phantoms also opened their score. An F-4B launched from the deck of the USS Midway shot down a MiG-17 fighter over Haiphong. On July 10, 1965, a U.S. Air Force F-4C scored its first victory, shooting down 2 MiG-17s.
Subsequently, encounters between MiGs and Phantoms in the skies over North Vietnam became a common occurrence. For instance, on September 20, 1965, a group of American aircraft appeared over the Kep railway station, north of Hanoi, and was detected by a Vietnamese P-35 radar. A portion of the Phantoms, armed with bombs, attacked the station. Top cover was provided by another pair of F-4Bs loitering at an altitude of 3,000 to 4,000 meters. A Vietnamese alert flight, 4 MiG-17Fs, was airborne and was guided toward the enemy by ground control. The leader of the first Vietnamese pair dived from 6,000 meters. Upon visually spotting the Americans, he attacked an F-4B that was executing a bombing run. The Vietnamese pilot opened fire from a distance of 500 meters, after which the Phantom began to evade the fire with a descending left turn. The MiG continued to sit on the tail of the enemy and fired a second burst from 400 meters. The Phantom began to smoke but continued flying. It was finally shot down by a third long burst from 200 meters. The American airmen were unable to eject. The second pair of MiGs engaged in combat at an altitude of 3,000 meters just as one American aircraft was pulling out of a dive after an attack, while the second was entering a dive for a bombing run. The Vietnamese flight commander attacked the first aircraft, opening fire somewhat prematurely from a distance of 1,200 meters. Spotting the MiG on his tail, the American pilot engaged his afterburners and disengaged from the fight. In general, it should be noted that until the MiG-21 arrived on the scene and the mass employment of S-75, SA-2 surface-to-air missile systems began, American aviation in the skies of Vietnam behaved rather carelessly, not viewing the small numbers of MiG-17s as a serious threat. For example, Phantoms flying escort duty were often loaded with bombs. The Vietnamese, however, sought to keep their MiGs at low altitude, where their small camouflaged aircraft were less visually conspicuous and practically invisible to the Americans' onboard radar. By launching surprise attacks on the fighter bombers, Vietnamese pilots forced them to jettison their bomb loads. Closing to short range, they would then gun them down with cannon fire. The escort fighters, occupying a higher flight corridor, often simply did not have time to engage the MiGs. This forced the Americans to change tactics and lower their cover groups to low altitudes. By positioning themselves at the same level as or below the Vietnamese fighters, the Phantoms could see them using their radar or visually against the sky background. Using their superior speed, the F-4s would close on the enemy, strike with missiles, and then disengage just as rapidly. However, if the fight devolved into a turning carousel, dogfight, the advantage shifted to the Vietnamese, who would quickly close the distance to less than 1,000 meters, where the F-4s, possessing only missile armament, were practically helpless.
However, the Americans soon refined their tactics again. Several Phantoms would accept close combat. One flight would allow itself to be drawn into a turning fight, while another would quickly climb and attack the MiGs from a distance of several kilometers using Sparrow missiles. After losing 6 fighters in such situations, the Vietnamese reverted to the previously proven tactic of sudden single-pass ambush strikes followed by a rapid disengagement. At the end of 1966, acting on the recommendations of Soviet military specialists, DRV Aviation pushed their interception line directly to the country's borders, where American aircraft flew in dense formations that hindered maneuvering combat. Another innovation was the practice of ground-based ambushes developed with Chinese participation. MiG-17s would take off from forward staging airfields to attack the enemy flying in tight formation, after which they would quickly descend and, camouflaged by the terrain, return to base.
Starting from February 1966, the F-4's primary adversaries became the supersonic MiG-21 F-13, some of Czechoslovakian manufacture, and the MiG-21 PFV, a tropicalized version of the all-weather MiG-21 PF equipped with a radar sight. Like the American aircraft, they were equipped with missile weaponry. R-3S guided missiles with infrared homing, or pods containing 55mm S-5 unguided aerial rockets. The U.S. Air Force and Navy commands continued to pin high hopes on the F-4, believing that its powerful armament, advanced onboard radar, and high speed and acceleration characteristics, combined with new tactics, would ensure the Phantom's superiority over enemy aircraft. However, in encounters with the lighter MiG-21s, the F-4 began to suffer defeat after defeat. From May through December 1966, the U.S. lost 47 aircraft in air combat while destroying only 12 enemy fighters. Factors contributing to this included high wing loading and somewhat lower turn rates, especially at medium altitudes for the American fighters. The Americans later admitted that the Phantom was generally inferior to the MiG in turning fights. Restrictions on operational G-loads, 6.0 versus 8.0 for the MiG-21 PF, and permissible angles of attack, as well as the inferior handling qualities of the American machine. Nor did the F-4 possess an advantage in thrust-to-weight ratio. At normal takeoff weight, it was 0.74 for the F-4B, compared to 0.79 for the MiG-21 PF. Primary among the Phantom's drawbacks were its unsatisfactory spin characteristics. There was a risk of entering a flat spin, from which a pilot of average skill could practically never recover. It was reported that by 1971 alone, 79 Phantoms had been lost due to spins. Although the F-4 fighter's onboard radar possessed a long detection and lock-on range, it had relatively low resistance to jamming. The cockpits of the pilot and the operator, weapons systems officer, or radar intercept officer, were cluttered with numerous instruments and switches. At the same time, the Phantom's merits demonstrated in Vietnam included somewhat better acceleration characteristics. The F-4E accelerated from 600 to 1,100 kilometers per hour in 20 seconds, while the MiG-21 PF took 27 seconds. A higher rate of climb, better cockpit visibility, and the presence of a second crew member who monitored the air situation and provided timely warnings to the commander about threats from the rear. The MiG-21's drawbacks included the short range of its radar sight, no more than 10 to 12 kilometers for fighter-sized targets, the radar's slow scan cycle, a hard-to-read target return on the cockpit display, and poor cockpit visibility. To switch weapon settings, the pilot had to take one hand off the flight controls. The fighter's engine smoked heavily in certain operating modes, which gave the aircraft's position. In clear weather, the MiG-21 could be spotted at a range of up to 30 kilometers. The first combat engagement involving the MiG-21 in Vietnam took place on April 23, 1966, and ended inconclusively. However, on April 26, Phantoms managed to shoot down the first MiG-21, opening the score in the duel between these fighters that would continue on the fronts of many local wars for more than 2 decades. The appearance of the new MiGs forced the American command to utilize Phantoms more broadly for escorting strike aircraft, finally abandoning the practice of equipping escort F-4s with bombs.
MiG-21s usually attack the enemy at supersonic speeds, launching missiles from the rear hemisphere and quickly breaking away to avoid potential pursuit. It was difficult for the Americans to counter this tactic, which required a high level of training for both the pilots and the ground control intercept officers. Joint operations between the 21s and MiG-17s also began to be practiced. The latter forced the enemy from low altitudes up to medium altitudes, where they were then attacked by the MiG-21s. In 1967, the Americans managed to somewhat improve the flight and tactical training of their fighter pilots. New F-4D aircraft, modernized based on war experience, began arriving in Air Force combat squadrons. On June 5, an F-4D fighter opened the kill count for this variant by shooting down a MiG-17 over Hanoi. The qualitative reinforcement of the American fighter force resulted in the DRV aviation managing to shoot down only 15 U.S. aircraft in air combat during the first half of 1967. However, Vietnamese fighters subsequently increased their effectiveness again, due to gained combat experience and the transition to new and modernized machine types, the MiG-21PF and MiG-17F, equipped with R-3S guided missiles. In the first half of 1968, the Vietnamese managed to destroy 25 enemy aircraft in 40 engagements. In total, during the first stage of the air war, from April 1965 to November 1968, 268 air battles took place over Vietnam, resulting in the downing of 244 American and 85 Vietnamese aircraft. This included 46 battles where losses amounted to 27 F-4s and 20 MiG-21s. In May 1968, Vietnamese-American negotiations began in Paris, resulting in the cessation of bombing of the DRV from November 1, 1968. A relative calm settled over the skies of Vietnam, and military actions shifted to the jungles of the South. From December 1968 to April 1972, only 5 air battles occurred over the border regions of the DRV and South Vietnam, including 4 battles in 1971, resulting in the loss of 1 F-4 fighter, 1 MiG-17, and an American OV-10A Bronco forward air control aircraft. The ensuing pause was used by both sides to qualitatively strengthen their fighter forces. From 1968, the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam began receiving F-4E fighters, featuring improved maneuverability, an internal cannon, and a new radar. In 1970, the 366th and 588th Tactical Fighter Wings stationed at Da Nang Air Base were almost completely re-equipped with the new aircraft. U.S. Navy carriers participating in combat operations received the improved F-4J carrier-based fighters. The Soviet side transferred MiG-21 PFM fighters with the GP-9 external gun pod to the Vietnamese Air Force, and slightly later, MiG-21 MF and MiG-21 MFL aircraft with the internal GSH-23 cannon. Additionally, in 1968 to 1969, China provided Vietnam with 44 J-6 fighters, a licensed version of the MiG-19. Realizing it was impossible to achieve superiority over enemy fighters in a short time, the Americans focused their main efforts on improving the combat skills of their pilots. the U.S. Air Force organized special retraining courses under the Red Flag program, during which they practiced air combat against aggressor squadrons equipped with Northrop F-5 fighters simulating MiG-21s. For naval aviators, on the initiative of Captain Frank Ault, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, familiar to us from the movie of the same name starring Tom Cruise, was organized in 1969. There, pilots underwent 5 weeks of intensive training under conditions that closely mimicked actual combat. In June 1971, the U.S. resumed raids on North Vietnam. In March-April 1972, a massive and highly successful offensive of the DRV armed forces began in the South. Striving to prevent the total military defeat of the Saigon government and to influence the negotiations in Paris, the Americans intensified their bombing of North. In the spring of 1972, having increased their aviation force to 1,000 combat aircraft, the U.S. conducted a large-scale air operation called Freedom Train from April 9th to May 7th. During this operation, a total of about 40 well-planned, powerful bombing strikes were launched against North Vietnamese lines of communication and airfields, leading to a significant reduction in clashes between Phantoms and MiGs. On April 16th, 2 MiG-21s engaged 12 Phantoms, and both Vietnamese aircraft were shot down. On April 27th, a flight of Phantoms encountered a pair of MiG-21s, and in the ensuing battle, lost 1 aircraft. On May 6th, a pair of Phantoms intercepted a pair of MiG-21s attempting to attack A-7 attack aircraft. 1 MiG was successfully shot down. On the same day, a flight of Phantoms engaged a quartet of MiG-21s. 6 missiles were fired at 1 MiG, but the experienced pilot managed to evade them. However, a subsequent salvo of 3 more American missiles finally hit the MiG-21, though the pilot ejected safely. In May 1968, Vietnamese-American negotiations began in Paris, resulting in the cessation of bombing of the DRV from November 1, 1968. A relative calm settled over the skies of Vietnam, and military actions shifted to the jungles of the South. From December 1968 to April 1972, only 5 air battles occurred over the border regions of the DRV and South Vietnam, including 4 battles in 1971, resulting in the loss of 1 F-4 fighter, 1 MiG-17, and an American OV-10A Bronco forward air control aircraft. The ensuing pause was used by both sides to qualitatively strengthen their fighter forces. From 1968, the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam began receiving F-4E fighters, featuring improved maneuverability, an internal cannon, and a new radar. In 1970, the 366th and 588th Tactical Fighter Wings stationed at Da Nang Air Base were almost completely re-equipped with the new aircraft. U.S. Navy carriers participating in combat operations received the improved F-4J carrier-based fighters. The Soviet side transferred MiG-21 PFM fighters with the GP-9 external gun pod to the Vietnamese Air Force, and slightly later, MiG-21 MF and MiG-21 MFL aircraft with the internal GSH-23 cannon. Additionally, in 1968 to 1969, China provided Vietnam with 44 J-6 fighters, a licensed version of the MiG-19. Realizing it was impossible to achieve superiority over enemy fighters in a short time, the Americans focused their main efforts on improving the combat skills of their pilots. The U.S. Air Force organized special retraining courses under the Red Flag program, during which they practiced air combat against aggressor squadrons equipped with Northrop F-5 fighters simulating MiG-21s. For naval aviators, on the initiative of Captain Frank Ault, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, familiar to us from the movie of the same name starring Tom Cruise, was organized in 1969. There, pilots underwent 5 weeks of intensive training under conditions that closely mimicked actual combat. In June 1971, the U.S. resumed raids on North Vietnam. In March-April 1972, a massive and highly successful offensive of the DRV armed forces began in the South. Striving to prevent the total military defeat of the Saigon government and to influence the negotiations in Paris, the Americans intensified their bombing of North. In the spring of 1972, having increased their aviation force to 1,000 combat aircraft, the U.S. conducted a large-scale air operation called Freedom Train from April 9th to May 7th. During this operation, a total of about 40 well-planned, powerful bombing strikes were launched against North Vietnamese lines of communication and airfields, leading to a significant reduction in clashes between Phantoms and MiGs. On April 16th, 2 MiG-21s engaged 12 Phantoms, and both Vietnamese aircraft were shot down. On April 27th, a flight of Phantoms encountered a pair of MiG-21s, and in the ensuing battle, lost 1 aircraft. On May 6th, a pair of Phantoms intercepted a pair of MiG-21s attempting to attack A-7 attack aircraft. 1 MiG was successfully shot down. On the same day, a flight of Phantoms engaged a quartet of MiG-21s. 6 missiles were fired at 1 MiG, but the experienced pilot managed to evade them. However, a subsequent salvo of 3 more American missiles finally hit the MiG-21.
During one of the battles on May 10th, a flight of MiG-17s scrambled to unblock a neighboring airfield. The MiGs approached the target covertly at extremely low altitude and shot down 1 Phantom on their first attack. The second pair of the flight was drawn into a maneuvering dogfight with a quartet of F-4s, ending in the loss of 1 MiG-17. However, drawing the Phantoms into the aerial carousel allowed the Vietnamese to launch 2 MiG-21s from the blockaded airfield. These attacked the same number of F-4s from a zoom climb at an altitude of 2 kilometers and shot down both Phantoms with just 2 R-3S missiles. On May 11th, 2 MiG-21s playing the role of bait lured a quartet of F-4s toward 2 MiG-21s loitering at low altitude. The MiGs swiftly attacked the Phantoms and shot down 2 enemy aircraft with 3 missiles. On June 13th, a flight of MiG-21s intercepted a group of Phantoms. Wedging themselves into the American formation, 2 Vietnamese fighters caused panic among the enemy. The Phantoms broke formation and began maneuvering disorderly. At that moment, the second pair of MiGs launched a missile attack and shot down 2 F-4s. On May 18th, Vietnamese aviation flew 26 combat sorties and conducted 8 air battles, costing the Americans 4 Phantoms. Vietnamese fighters suffered no losses that day. During one of the battles, 2 MiG-21s intercepted a flight of Phantoms. The leader of the Vietnamese pair, Captain Ngu, attacked from a split S maneuver and shot down an F-4 with a single missile. In the summer of 1972, the intensity of air battles began to wane and aerial clashes became episodic. For instance, on June 12th, a flight of Phantoms fought 2 MiG-21s and lost 1 aircraft. The following day, 2 more air battles occurred, costing the Americans another 2 F-4s. The Vietnamese side suffered no losses.
As a result of the aerial offensive launched by the Americans in the spring and summer of 1972, by autumn, the 360 tactical fighters of the U.S. Air Force and 96 U.S. Navy fighters in the theater of combat operations, most of which were late-model Phantoms, were opposed by only 187 DRV, North Vietnamese, fighters, MiG-17, MiG-21, J-6. It should be noted that of this number, only 71 aircraft, including 31 MiG-21s, were combat capable. In September 1972, the only aerial engagement occurred in which a Soviet pilot operated against Phantoms on the Vietnamese side. A Vietnamese fighter pilot and a Soviet instructor were practicing flight techniques in a two-seat MiG-21 US trainer aircraft, which carried no armament. At a distance of 8 kilometers from their airfield, they received a warning about a flight of Phantoms approaching at low altitude. By this time, only 800 liters of fuel remained in the MiG's tanks. Attempting to evade the strike, the fighter pilot executed a barrel roll with a side slip, thereby disrupting the attack of the first American pair. The MiG-21 US was then attacked twice by the enemy's second pair. However, in a high G turn, it again evaded the strike and the missiles missed. The Americans' third attack was also fruitless, but the MiG's energetic maneuvering right above the ground with the afterburner engaged consumed the last remnants of fuel, and the crew made the only correct decision, to eject. During the ascent, the aircraft's engine unexpectedly stopped, and at that moment, the MiG was hit by a missile fired from an F-4. Fortunately, the crew managed to land safely by parachute. In December, the Americans commenced the implementation of their final large-scale operation, Linebacker II, aimed at leveraging specific conditions during the negotiations in Paris. The operation planned for the further destruction of North Vietnam's infrastructure and the incapacitation of its military facilities via massive airstrikes involving a large number of Boeing B-52 strategic bombers. However, the preparation for such a powerful strike as Linebacker II could not be conducted unobserved, enabling the Vietnamese side to develop a series of countermeasures. A surprise for the Americans was the use of MiG-21s from camouflaged dispersal strips, where the aircraft were delivered via external sling on heavy Mi-6 helicopters and launched using solid fuel boosters. Over the 12 days of Operation Linebacker II, December 18 through 29, during 8 aerial battles, 7 American aircraft, including 4 Phantoms and 3 Vietnamese MiG-21s, were shot down. At the same time, the 21s tried not to get involved in turning fights. Instead, after executing a supersonic intercept, regardless of the result, they quickly left the battlefield. However, when forced in some cases to get drawn into a dogfight, the MiG-21 fighters maintained an advantage at medium altitudes over the modernized F-4E and F-4J, losing it only near the ground. On December 22, 1972, 2 MiG-21s were scrambled to intercept Americans. One was shot down by a Phantom. On December 23, 4 MiG-21s took to the air, shooting down 1 F-4. On December 27, Vietnamese aerial aviation again engaged American aircraft, destroying 2 Phantoms. On December 28, 2 on-duty MiG-21s took off from Noi Bai airfield to intercept a group of American aircraft detected by radar stations. When they closed on the enemy at low altitude, 300 meters, and received ground command guidance, 2 minutes after takeoff, the Vietnamese engaged afterburners and put their machines into a climb. During the subsequent turn with formation change, the wingman visually detected a flight of Phantoms at a distance of about 8 kilometers from their airfield and requested permission from the leader to attack. The Americans noticed the enemy's appearance too late and failed to initiate a defensive maneuver in time. As a result, 1 F-4 was shot down by a missile. After executing the attack, the wingman began forming up with the leader. At that moment, the commander of the Vietnamese pair spotted 2 more Phantoms. With an energetic maneuver, he disrupted the American combat formation and cut off his wingman, whom he lost sight of at that time, from the enemy aircraft. 2 separate maneuvering battles ensued. The lead MiG managed to break away from the F-4s by diving sharply to the ground, while the wingman, turning in circles, damaged another Phantom, but while attempting to exit the battle, his plane was damaged by fragments of an American missile that exploded a few meters from the fuselage. The Vietnamese pilot ejected safely. During the raids of heavy B-52 bombers on Hanoi, F-4s several times played the role of decoys. A flight of F-4s, possessing good formation coordination, flew in a tight formation. Judging by Vietnamese radar readings, the flight represented a single large target of the bomber class. While interceptors were guided toward the imaginary B-52, the target would vanish in the air, splitting into 4 aircraft that then counterattacked the Vietnamese fighters themselves. In total, 201 aerial battles occurred between American and Vietnamese aircraft in 1972. As a result, 54 Vietnamese fighters were lost, including 36 MiG-21s and 1 MiG-21 US, and 90 American machines, including 74 F-4 fighters and 2 RF-4C reconnaissance planes. Thus, MiG-21s destroyed 67 enemy aircraft. The last victory of the Vietnam War, according to American data, the 197th in total, was achieved by a Phantom on January 12, 1973. An F-4J, Commander Lieutenant Victor Kovaleski, launching from the deck of the aircraft carrier Midway, shot down a MiG-17 fighter with a Sidewinder missile. Ironically, Victor Kovaleski's F-4J also became the last Phantom shot down in the skies of Vietnam 2 days later. The pilot and RIO managed to survive. On January 27, 1973, the USA announced the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, effectively acknowledging its defeat in this war. The war spawned its own heroes. The most successful Phantom crew in Vietnam was pilot S. Ritchie and weapons systems officer C. de Bellevue, who shot down 5 MiGs each. Additionally, C. de Bellevue shot down 1 more plane with another pilot. A unique record holder among the Vietnamese was pilot Ha Van Tuc, who entered battle in his MiG-21 against 36 enemy aircraft, and in the process shot down the aircraft of the American Fighter Air Wing commander, Colonel D. Folin. It must be acknowledged that the rivalry between MiGs and Phantoms in the Vietnamese sky ended, on the whole, with the defeat of the American machine. F-4 fighters managed to shot down 54 MiG-21 aircraft during the entire period of hostilities from 1966 to 1972, while during the same period, the 21s destroyed 103 Phantoms. Furthermore, the loss of 1 American aircraft usually led to the death or capture of 2 crew members. Additionally, the Phantom cost American taxpayers a sum several times exceeding the cost of a single MiG-21. In general, F-4 aircraft in Vietnam had to solve tasks not inherent to their design. Created as a heavy interceptor intended to defend carrier strike groups from raids of high-speed bombers and anti-ship cruise missiles, the Phantom was used in the struggle for air superiority, opposing the MiG-21, which was better adapted for this role. Therefore, the Americans' defeat is explained not by errors of the McDonnell Douglas designers, who managed to create an outstanding combat aircraft for its time, but by the U.S.'s lack of a specialized light dogfighter capable of opposing the MiG-21 on equal terms. Despite the fact that the U.S. Air Force possessed Convair F-102 and F-106 fighters, Lockheed F-104, and Northrop F-5 fighters, these machines were significantly inferior in a number of parameters to both the MiG-21 and the F-4, and were not used in aerial battles over the territory of the DRV. The Vought F-8 Crusader, light carrier-based supersonic fighter, upon which great hopes were initially placed, at the beginning of the war, the ratio of these aircraft to F-4Bs on the decks of American carriers deployed in the Gulf of Tonkin was approximately equal, also failed to meet expectations, yielding to the MiG-21 in key flight characteristics. However, in the role of a tactical strike aircraft, the F-4 performed excellently. Phantoms were widely utilized for strikes against particularly important targets, bridges, power plants, and enemy rail transport. To solve these tasks, the aircraft were typically armed with free-fall bombs and unguided rockets of 70 and 127 mm caliber. From April 1965, free hunt missions by pairs or flights of Phantoms were practiced over the railways and highways of Vietnam. The aircraft continuously combed enemy lines of communication, in places completely paralyzing movement during daylight hours. The experience of the Vietnam War had a tremendous influence on military aircraft construction in both the U.S. and the USSR. The Americans reacted to the defeat of the Phantom in aerial combat by creating highly maneuverable fourth-generation fighters, the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Freedom Fighter, designed to surpass the MiG-21 in close-range maneuvering combat. The influence of the MiG on the American military was so great that at the formation of the heavy F-15 fighter's design, it was proposed at a fairly high level to abandon Sparrow medium-range missiles and the onboard radar entirely, focusing efforts on improving maneuverability characteristics. At the same time, the Universal Soldier F-4 also influenced the minds of Russian aviation theorists, which was reflected in modifications of third-generation fighters. However, after the conclusion of the war in Vietnam, the confrontation between MiGs and Phantoms in the skies did not cease. MiG-21s and F-4s clashed in aerial skirmishes over the Suez Canal, in the skies of Sinai, over the Nile Delta and Syria in 1973, in Lebanon in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and during the years of the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988.